London, 1845. The dark oak-panelled walls of Thornwick Manor seemed to absorb what little autumn sunlight filtered through the heavy velvet curtains. York Thorn, the 7th Duke of Ravenscroft, sat motionless at his desk, his fingers tracing the edges of the letter that had arrived that morning. His steely grey eyes, once described as captivating by the ladies of London society, now held only coldness, a reflection of the heart that beat mechanically in his chest. "Your Grace," his butler Stevens announced from the doorway, "Lady Whitmore's carriage has been spotted approaching the manor. She arrives earlier than expected." York folded the letter and slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. "Very well. Show her to the blue drawing-room when she arrives. And shall I inform her that you will join shortly?" "No," the Duke rose, straightening his immaculate black tailcoat. "Inform her that I have pressing business in London and regrettably must postpone our meeting." Stephen's face remained impassive, though he had served the Duke long enough to recognize the falsehood. "As you wish, Your Grace." When the door closed, York moved to the window, pulling back the heavy drapes to watch the approaching carriage. Another matchmaking attempt, this one orchestrated by his aunt, who remained determined to see him remarried despite his explicit refusal to entertain such notions. 5 years as a widower had solidified his resolve. Love was a luxury afforded to the naive and foolish, a lesson he had learned at considerable cost. The carriage disappeared from view as it rounded the drive toward the entrance. York let the curtain fall back into place, casting the room once again into shadow. He preferred it that way. The darkness suited the man he had become. His life now consisted of efficient management of his vast estates, occasional appearances in Parliament where his title demanded, and a calculated distance from anything resembling emotional entanglement. The gossips of London had long since ceased their speculation about his romantic prospects. The Duke of Ravenscroft was considered firmly beyond the reach of even the most ambitious debutantes. "They say he died the same day as his Duchess," he had once overheard at a ball. "Only his body continues to move about London." The assessment, though whispered behind gloved hands, was not entirely incorrect. Grace Ashford pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the carriage window as Thornwick Manor came into view. The grand stone structure rose imposingly against the grey autumn sky, its Gothic towers and immaculate gardens conveying wealth and history in equal measure. She smoothed the folds of her modest blue dress, feeling increasingly out of place with each rotation of the carriage wheels. "Remember why you're here," she whispered to herself. Her brother Edward's letter had been quite clear about the desperate nature of their circumstances. Their father's death had revealed not an expected modest inheritance, but crushing debts, and Edward's subsequent investments had only worsened their situation. The position of governess at Thornwick Manor was their last hope before complete financial ruin. The carriage came to a stop at the grand entrance, where Grace was greeted by a stern-faced butler. "Miss Ashford, I presume?" he inquired, his gaze taking quick inventory of her simple attire. "Yes," she replied, gathering her small valise. "I've come regarding the governess position." The butler's eyebrows rose slightly. "I was expecting Lady Whitmore. There must be some confusion. His Grace is unavailable today, having departed for London on urgent business." Grace bit her lower lip. "There's been no confusion, sir. I was hired by letter from the Duchess Dowager to serve as governess to Lady Helena. I was instructed to arrive today." The Dowager Duchess, the butler's expression shifted from confusion to understanding. "Ah." Her Grace did not inform his Grace of this arrangement, it seems. He paused, considering. "I am Stevens, the head butler. Please come inside while I sort this matter." Grace followed Stevens into the grand entrance hall, where marble floors and ancestral portraits created an atmosphere of intimidating grandeur. She felt conspicuously ordinary standing beneath the massive crystal chandelier, clutching her valise like a shield. "Wait here," Stevens instructed, before disappearing through a side door. Left alone, Grace studied the portrait dominating the hall, a formidable-looking man with piercing grey eyes and an unyielding expression. The current Duke, she presumed, though the painting conveyed none of the warmth one might expect in a commissioned portrait. She was still examining it when raised voices from beyond the door caught her attention. I did not authorize this appointment. The deep, commanding voice could only belong to the Duke himself. The child needs education and feminine guidance, York. An elderly woman's voice, presumably the Dowager Duchess. You cannot keep her isolated from proper society forever. Lady Helena is perfectly content with her tutors. A 9-year-old girl needs more than tutors and your occasional visits when you remember you have a daughter. Grace stepped back from the door, uncomfortable at overhearing such a private exchange. Her discomfort only increased when the door suddenly opened, revealing both speakers. The Duke was even more imposing in person than in his portrait, tall and broad-shouldered, with raven-black hair showing traces of silver at the temples despite his apparent age of not more than 35. His eyes, however, were what struck Grace most forcefully, cold, assessing, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Miss Ashford, I presume." His voice was controlled, each syllable precise and clipped. "Yes, Your Grace," Grace curtsied, keeping her gaze steady despite her racing heart. "It appears there has been a misunderstanding. My mother failed to consult me regarding your employment." He cast a disapproving glance at the elderly woman beside him. The Dowager Duchess, a small woman with remarkably upright posture and shrewd eyes, lifted her chin defiantly. "There was no misunderstanding, York. Miss Ashford comes with excellent recommendations from Lady Calloway, whose own daughters benefited greatly from her instruction." "Nevertheless," the Duke began. "If I may, Your Grace," Grace interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "I understand this arrangement was unexpected, but I assure you I am well qualified to guide Lady Helena in her studies and social development. However, if my presence is unwelcome, I shall of course depart." The Duke studied her with that penetrating grey gaze. "You appear remarkably composed for someone who has travelled here unnecessarily." "Necessity is relative, Your Grace. What is unnecessary to some may be desperately needed by others." The words slipped out before Grace could consider their wisdom. Something flickered briefly in the Duke's expression, surprise, perhaps, at her candour. The Dowager Duchess smiled slightly. "You see, York, Miss Ashford possesses the very forthrightness Helena requires." York Thorn remained silent for a long moment before speaking. "Stevens will show you to your quarters, Miss Ashford. You may remain for a trial period of 1 month. After that time, I shall determine if your services are required." Before Grace could thank him, the Duke turned and strode away, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The Dowager Duchess patted Grace's arm. "Do not be discouraged by my son's manner, Miss Ashford. Beneath that frozen exterior beats a heart that once knew warmth." "I'm simply grateful for the opportunity, Your Grace." "As you should be." The elderly woman's expression grew serious. "But understand this, you face 2 challenges here at Thornwick. One is to educate a spirited girl who has had little feminine influence in her life. The other," she glanced in the direction her son had departed, "the other is considerably more formidable." "I don't understand." "You will," the Dowager sighed. "Stevens, please show Miss Ashford to her rooms and introduce her to Lady Helena after she has had time to refresh herself." As Grace followed the butler up the grand staircase, she couldn't help feeling that she had stepped into something far more complicated than a governess position. The weight of unseen expectations pressed upon her, heavier than the small valise in her hand. York stood at the window of his study, watching the sunset paint the gardens in rich autumn hues. His mother's meddling was becoming increasingly bold, first the attempted matchmaking with Lady Whitmore, and now this governess business. Both efforts spoke to the same end, forcing him to rejoin the world of the living. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he commanded. Stevens appeared, his expression carefully neutral. "Lady Helena is asking to see you, Your Grace. She wishes to inquire about her new governess." York suppressed a sigh. He had intended to write to his daughter, as their communication typically occurred. Direct interaction with Helena always left him feeling inadequate, a reminder of his failure to be the father she deserved. "Tell her I shall see her tomorrow at breakfast." "If I may, Your Grace," Stevens ventured carefully, "the young lady seems quite animated by the prospect of Miss Ashford's arrival. Perhaps a brief meeting tonight would ease her curiosity. York turned from the window, studying his loyal servant's face. Stevens rarely offered such suggestions, which meant he considered this matter important. Very well. Send her in. Moments later, the door opened again, admitting a small figure with dark curls and solemn grey eyes, a feminine echo of his own. Helena curtsied formally, as she had been taught. "Good evening, father." "Helena," York gestured to a chair, "I understand you wish to discuss your new governess." The girl perched on the edge of the seat, her legs swinging slightly. "Is she kind?" "Grandmother said she would be kind." The simple question caught York off guard. He had assessed Miss Ashford's qualifications and appearance, but had given no thought to her temperament. She seemed forthright, he offered, recalling the way Miss Ashford had spoken to him in the entrance hall. Helena considered this. Does forthright mean kind? Not necessarily, but in Miss Ashford's case, perhaps the two qualities coincide. He found himself oddly curious about his daughter's interest. "Why is her kindness important to you?" Helena looked down at her hands. "Mrs. Winters always said I asked too many questions, and Mr. Fletcher said my penmanship showed a lack of proper discipline." York frowned, realizing how little he knew about his daughter's experience with her previous tutors. "I see. Will Miss Ashford stay long, or will she leave like the others?" The question carried a weight York hadn't anticipated. How many governesses and tutors had passed through Helena's life, each departure another small abandonment? "That depends on whether she proves suitable," he answered carefully. Helena nodded, accepting this conditional response with a resignation that seemed inappropriate for a child of 9 years. "May I be excused, father?" "Yes, of course." She slid from the chair and curtsied again before leaving the room, closing the door with careful quietness behind her. York remained motionless, struck by the formality of their interaction. Had he become such a stranger to his own daughter that she treated him with the cautious deference of a subject approaching a monarch? The realization was uncomfortable, forcing him to acknowledge what he had long avoided. In protecting himself from emotional entanglements, he had also walled himself off from the one person who should matter most. He moved to his desk and pulled out the letter that had arrived that morning, a communication from his solicitor regarding investments, business matters, safe matters. He tried to focus on the contents, but found his thoughts drifting to Miss Ashford's arrival and its potential consequences for the carefully ordered existence he had constructed. "Necessity is relative, Your Grace. What is unnecessary to some may be desperately needed by others." Her words returned to him unexpectedly. There had been something in her steady gaze that suggested she understood necessity all too well. Perhaps his mother's interference, annoying as it was, might benefit Helena. The child deserved more than he had given her, more than the cold, distant parenting that mirrored his own upbringing. As for Miss Ashford herself, York determined to maintain appropriate distance. The governess would attend to Helena's education and social development, nothing more. She would not disrupt the careful equilibrium of Thornwick Manor, nor would she penetrate the walls he had built around what remained of his heart. On this point, the Duke of Ravenscroft was quite resolved. Grace's first week at Thornwick Manor passed in a whirlwind of discovery. Lady Helena proved to be an intelligent, curious child, starved for genuine attention and approval. Behind her formal manners lay a spirited nature that emerged cautiously, like a woodland creature testing whether it was safe to venture from hiding. "Miss Ashford, is it true that ladies in London wear feathers on their heads tall enough to brush the chandeliers?" Helena asked during their afternoon lesson. Grace smiled at the girl's widening eyes. "Some fashionable ladies do wear rather extravagant plumage, though I believe chandeliers remain safely untouched." "Have you been to many grand balls?" "A few," Grace admitted, not adding that her experiences had been as a companion to wealthier relatives rather than as a guest in her own right. Helena sighed dreamily. "Father says balls are frivolous wastes of time where people engage in meaningless social rituals." "Does he indeed?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think, Lady Helena?" The girl appeared startled by the question. "What I think?" "Yes, you've heard your father's opinion, but surely you have your own thoughts on the matter." Helena considered this novel concept carefully. I think I should like to see for myself whether balls are frivolous. Perhaps some parts are silly, but others might be wonderful. That's an excellent approach, Grace praised. Forming your own opinions based on experience rather than accepting others' judgments without question. Even father's judgments? Helena asked, lowering her voice as if the question itself were slightly treasonous. Even the wisest people can have blind spots in their thinking, particularly regarding matters they've chosen to avoid. Grace closed the geography book they had been studying. Though perhaps we should return to the location of major European capitals rather than the location of London ballrooms. Helena giggled, a sound Grace suspected was rarely heard within Thornwick's sombre walls. The lesson continued, but Grace found herself contemplating the Duke's apparent aversion to society. The servants' whispers had provided fragments of understanding, a brief, reportedly passionate marriage cut short by tragedy. The Duke's subsequent withdrawal from society. His transformation from a man once known for his charm to the austere, remote figure who now stalked Thornwick's corridors like a ghost, haunting his own home. Later that evening, Grace was summoned to the Duke's study, the first direct interaction since her arrival. She found him standing by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, his severe profile illuminated by the flames. "Miss Ashford," he acknowledged without turning, "I understand you've begun Helena's instruction." "Yes, Your Grace. She's a remarkably bright child with a natural curiosity. And her deportment. My mother seems to believe it requires attention." Grace chose her words carefully. Lady Helena has excellent manners, though they sometimes appear rehearsed rather than natural. With more social interaction, I believe she would develop greater confidence. Now he did turn, his expression guarded. "What precisely do you mean by social interaction?" "Opportunities to converse with people beyond her tutors and household staff. Perhaps visits with children her own age." The Duke's jaw tightened. The neighboring families have few suitable companions for Helena. Then perhaps occasional visits to London might. No, the word fell between them like a stone. Thornwick provides everything Helena requires for her development. The influences of London society are precisely what I wish to protect her from. Grace felt a flare of frustration on the child's behalf. "With respect, Your Grace, sheltering Lady Helena so completely may leave her ill-prepared for the world she must eventually enter." "The world," he repeated with quiet bitterness. "The world is filled with false smiles concealing calculation, with promises made to be broken when convenience dictates. I see no benefit in exposing my daughter to such lessons prematurely." The vehemence of his response revealed more than his words. Grace recognized the source of his protectiveness, not mere strictness, but genuine fear born of personal pain. "Not everything beyond these walls is corrupt, Your Grace," she said gently. "There is beauty and kindness to be found as well." "You speak like someone who has never witnessed the darker aspects of human nature." "On the contrary," Grace countered, surprising herself with her boldness, "I have experienced considerable disappointment and hardship. But I choose not to let those experiences determine my entire worldview." The Duke studied her with sudden intensity, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. "An admirable philosophy, Miss Ashford, though perhaps naive. What disappointments could possibly have shaped your perspective to any meaningful degree?" The dismissive question strung, reminding Grace of the invisible gulf between their stations. "My disappointments may seem trivial compared to yours, Your Grace, but they are significant to me. We each carry our own burdens." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of regret, perhaps, at his condescension. "Indeed," he moved to his desk, indicating their conversation was concluding. "You may continue Helena's education as you see fit within the boundaries of Thornwick. I shall review your progress at the end of the month, as planned." "Thank you, Your Grace." Grace curtsied and turned to leave. "Miss Ashford." She paused at the door. "Helena mentioned that you've been reading poetry with her," she seemed animated by it. Grace allowed herself a small smile. She has a natural appreciation for language and imagery. Yesterday, she composed her own verse about the changing leaves in the garden. The Duke appeared momentarily disconcerted, as though this information about his daughter was both surprising and significant. "I see. Good evening, Miss Ashford." "Good evening, Your Grace." As Grace closed the study door behind her, she sensed that something had shifted in their interaction, a hairline crack in the Duke's imposing facade. The challenge of educating Helena remained her primary focus, but she couldn't help wondering about the man who had sealed himself away from life so completely. What tragedy could turn a heart so thoroughly to stone? And was it truly stone all the way through, or merely encased in protective layers that might, with patience, be carefully chipped away? York found his thoughts returning to his conversation with Miss Ashford with frustrating frequency over the following days. Her observation about Helena's poetry had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. His daughter was developing interests and talents he knew nothing about, growing into a person, while he remained fixated on protecting the child he remembered. He had taken to observing their lessons from a distance, positioning himself in the library that adjoined the morning room where Grace conducted Helena's studies. The connecting door, left slightly ajar, allowed him to hear their interactions without revealing his presence. "Lady Helena, imagine you are attending a dinner where you're seated beside someone you've never met. How might you begin a conversation?" Grace's voice carried clearly. "I would introduce myself," Helena answered promptly. "Excellent, and then?" A pause. "I would ask if they enjoyed the soup." Grace's laugh was warm and genuine. "That would certainly be polite, but perhaps we could find a more engaging topic. What if you discovered this person had recently traveled somewhere interesting?" "I would ask about their journey." Helena's voice grew animated. "Whether they saw exciting things or met interesting people." Perfect. Showing interest in others is the foundation of pleasant conversation. People generally enjoy speaking about themselves when they feel their experiences are genuinely valued. York found himself smiling slightly at the practical nature of the lesson. Miss Ashford wasn't merely teaching Helena rules of etiquette, but the human understanding that underpinned meaningful social interaction. "Miss Ashford," Helena's voice turned hesitant, "do you think father ever feels lonely?" The unexpected question caused York to freeze, his breath caught in his throat. "That's a thoughtful question," Grace responded carefully. "Perhaps you might ask him yourself." "I wouldn't know how," Helena admitted. "He always seems so busy with important things." Sometimes adults become accustomed to keeping their feelings private, especially when they believe they must appear strong for others. "Like father being strong for me." "Possibly," Grace agreed. "But remember, true strength often includes acknowledging when we need connection with others." York stepped away from the door, disturbed by the direction of the conversation and his reaction to it. He had believed his arrangements for Helena were sufficient: a comfortable home, excellent education, material security. Yet the child wondered if he was lonely. More troubling still, he had no ready answer to the question. Later that afternoon, he encountered Grace in the portrait gallery. She stood before the painting of his late wife, Catherine, who gazed from the canvas with the serene smile that had once captivated London society. She was beautiful, Grace commented, apparently unsurprised by his approach despite his silent footsteps. Yes, York agreed, studying the familiar features that still provoked a dull ache in his chest. The artist captured her likeness well, though not her spirit. How would you describe her spirit, if I may ask? The question was presumptuous, yet York found himself answering. Catherine was vivacious. She approached life as though it were a grand adventure awaiting her direction. Rooms brightened when she entered them. Lady Helena has her eyes, Grace observed. And her curiosity, York added, the admission surprising him. Though Catherine's was more undisciplined. Grace turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. Your daughter mentioned that tomorrow is the anniversary of your wife's passing. I thought perhaps we might postpone lessons, so she could mark the day in whatever way you customarily observe it. York stiffened. There is no customary observance. The date passes like any other. Grace's eyes widened slightly. Forgive me, but Lady Helena seemed to believe the day carried significance. She asked if she might visit her mother's grave. Did she? York felt a tightening in his chest. I was unaware Helena took note of the date. Children often understand more than we credit them for, Grace said gently. Perhaps sharing memories of her mother would comfort her. There is little comfort to be found in dwelling on what cannot be changed, York replied, his tone hardening. Helena was barely 4 years old when Catherine died. Her memories are likely constructions based on servant stories rather than genuine recollections. Even so, those stories help her connect to an important part of her heritage. Grace hesitated before continuing. Your Grace, may I speak frankly? You rarely seem to do otherwise, Miss Ashford. A brief smile touched her lips. Lady Helena yearns to understand her mother, but she also desires to understand you, the father who exists beyond formal interactions and occasional correspondence. You overstep your position, York warned, uncomfortable with her perception. Perhaps, Grace acknowledged, but I speak only out of concern for Lady Helena's emotional well-being, which falls within my responsibilities as her governess. York studied her resolute expression, finding no trace of the intimidation his tone usually inspired. You are a most unconventional governess, Miss Ashford. I believe that may be precisely what Lady Helena requires, Your Grace. She curtsied briefly. With your permission, I shall adjust tomorrow's lessons to allow Lady Helena time for reflection, whether or not you choose to share that time with her. As he watched her walk away, York was struck by the peculiar sensation that despite his title and authority, Miss Grace Ashford had somehow gained the upper hand in their exchange. More disconcerting still was the realization that he did not entirely resent it. The morning of the anniversary dawned grey and misty, matching York's mood as he dressed in sombre silence. 5 years had passed since Catherine's death, yet the day still pressed upon him with suffocating weight. His custom was to spend the hours alone with a bottle of brandy and memories he otherwise kept tightly confined. This year, however, Helena's awareness of the date had introduced an uncomfortable complication. His daughter's desire to visit Catherine's grave required a response he felt ill-equipped to provide. A knock at his chamber door interrupted his thoughts. Enter, he called, expecting Stevens with his morning correspondence. Instead, the door opened to reveal Helena, already dressed in a black frock, her hands clasped nervously before her. "Good morning, Father," she said, her small voice unusually determined. "I've come to ask if we might visit Mother's grave together today." York froze, caught off guard by her direct approach. "Helena, Miss Ashford said I should speak plainly about what matters to me," she continued quickly, as if afraid her courage might desert her. "And it matters very much that we remember Mother properly today." York looked into his daughter's grey eyes, so like his own, yet filled with an earnestness he had long since lost. For a moment he considered refusing, retreating behind the shield of necessary business affairs. Instead, he found himself nodding. "Very well, we shall go after breakfast." Helena's face brightened momentarily before settling into appropriate solemnity. "Thank you, Father." The family chapel where Catherine was interred lay a quarter-mile from the main house, a Gothic structure of weathered stone nestled among ancient yew trees. York had avoided the place since the funeral, leaving the maintenance to groundskeepers. Now, walking the damp path with Helena's small hand in his, he felt an increasing tension with each step. Grace accompanied them at Helena's insistence, though she maintained a respectful distance as they approached the chapel. York was surprisingly grateful for her presence, which seemed to provide Helena with security and him with an odd sort of courage by proxy. Inside, the chapel air hung heavy with the scent of stone and lingering incense. Light filtered through stained glass, casting coloured patterns across Catherine's marble tomb. Her effigy lay atop it, hands folded serenely over her heart, her features rendered with painful accuracy. Helena approached the tomb with quiet reverence, placing a small bouquet of late roses, Catherine's favourites, at the stone feet. "I remember her singing," Helena said suddenly. "Was that real, Father, or did I imagine it?" York swallowed against the tightness in his throat. "It was real. Your mother sang to you each night before bed, French lullabies her own mother taught her. Helena nodded, absorbing this confirmation of her fragile memory. What else did she do? Miss Ashford says everyone has habits and favorite things that make them special. The simple question breached defenses York had maintained for years. Suddenly, he was speaking of Catherine's passion for riding at dawn, her habit of rearranging flowers the gardeners had already arranged, her infectious laugh that could transform the sternest faces in any drawing room. "She sounds wonderful," Helena said when he fell silent. "I wish I remembered more." "As do I," York admitted softly. He glanced up to find Grace watching them, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Embarrassed by his uncharacteristic openness, he straightened, resuming his customary reserve. "We should return to the house. The air is damp, and I would not have you catch cold." As they walked back, Helena between them, Grace spoke quietly. "Thank you for sharing those memories, Your Grace. They clearly meant a great deal to Lady Helena." "They are merely facts," York replied, uncomfortable with her perception. "Facts infused with feeling become something more," Grace observed. "They become connection." York had no response to this simple truth. Instead, he focused on the path ahead, trying to ignore the unfamiliar warmth that had briefly penetrated the cold emptiness he had cultivated for so long. That evening he found himself at his desk, a sheet of paper before him and pen in hand. The words came slowly at first, then with increasing fluency, memories of Catherine not as the idealized duchess, but as the woman she had truly been, with her impatience for tedious social obligations, her tendency to speak without considering consequences, her boundless enthusiasm for projects she often abandoned halfway. When the letter was complete, he sealed it carefully and summoned Stevens. "Please deliver this to Lady Helena's room," he instructed. "It is to be placed on her bedside table for her to find in the morning." Stevens accepted the letter with a bow. "Very good, Your Grace." Alone again, York moved to the window, watching as mist shrouded the gardens in ghostly white. For the first time in years, the anniversary had passed without Brandy's numbing influence. The pain remained, but it felt somehow different, less like a wound freshly reopened, and more like an old injury that had finally begun to heal imperfectly but genuinely. He wondered how much of this shift could be attributed to Miss Ashford's influence. In just weeks, the governess had altered the household's atmosphere with her gentle persistence and forthright manner. Helena was noticeably more animated, the servants moved with lighter steps, and even his mother had remarked on the positive change during her weekly visit. York himself had begun seeking opportunities to observe Grace's interactions with Helena, telling himself it was merely to evaluate her methods. Yet he found his attention increasingly drawn to Grace herself, the graceful tilt of her head when listening intently, the expressive hands that accompanied her explanations, the quiet confidence that infused her movements. These observations disturbed him. Miss Ashford was his daughter's governess, a woman of good breeding but limited means employed in his household. His interest, however innocent it might currently be, was inappropriate and potentially damaging to them both. York resolved to maintain stricter boundaries henceforth. The month's trial period would conclude in another week, at which point he would formalize her position while establishing clearer parameters for their interaction. Distance was necessary, not merely to protect his long-guarded heart, but to shield Grace from the complications his attention might create. Having settled this matter in his mind, York retired for the night, unaware that his carefully constructed defenses had already begun to crumble. Grace stood in the library, searching for a volume of poetry Helena had expressed interest in, when she heard the door open behind her. Turning, she found the Duke regarding her with an unreadable expression. "Your Grace," she acknowledged with a slight curtsy. "I was looking for Wordsworth's collected works for Lady Helena's literature lesson." "Third shelf bound in green leather," he replied, moving further into the room. "Though I wonder if Wordsworth isn't rather advanced for a child of 9. "Helena has a remarkable capacity for language," Grace explained. "She particularly enjoys 'I wandered lonely as a cloud.' I believe the imagery speaks to her." York nodded, seemingly unsurprised by this assessment of his daughter's sensibilities. "Your trial month concludes tomorrow, Miss Ashford." "Yes, Your Grace." Grace steadied herself, uncertain whether his tone indicated satisfaction or dismissal. "I have prepared a formal contract for your continued employment." He withdrew a folded document from his coat. "The terms are generous, I believe, reflecting my satisfaction with your influence on Helena's development." Relief washed through Grace. "Thank you, Your Grace. I'm pleased to have met your expectations." "You have exceeded them," York corrected, his voice dropping slightly. "Helena is happier than I have seen her in some time." The admission seemed to cost him effort, as though acknowledging the positive change required him to recognize the previous lack. "She's a remarkable child," Grace said. "Intelligent, sensitive, eager to please, particularly you, Your Grace." York's gaze shifted away from hers. "I am aware that my relationship with Helena has been insufficient. Your observations on that matter, while presumptuous, were not entirely without merit." Coming from the Duke, this statement constituted a significant concession. Grace felt a small surge of hope for both father and daughter. "The contract," York continued, extending the document toward her. "Please review it at your leisure and inform Stevens of your decision." As Grace reached for the papers, her fingers briefly brushed against his. The contact was momentary, yet she felt a distinct jolt, not unpleasant, but startling in its intensity. York's reaction was similarly pronounced. He withdrew his hand as though burned, his expression shifting from composed to guarded in an instant. "Is something amiss, Your Grace?" Grace inquired, concerned by his sudden tension. "Not at all." York stepped back, increasing the distance between them. "I merely recalled an urgent correspondence requiring my attention." "Good day, Miss Ashford." He departed with uncharacteristic haste, leaving Grace alone with the contract and the lingering sensation of that brief contact. She examined her reaction with growing concern. The flutter in her chest, the warmth that had spread through her at his touch, these were dangerous feelings to harbor toward her employer, particularly one as emotionally unavailable as the Duke of Ravenscroft. Yet in recent weeks, Grace had glimpsed fragments of the man beneath the austere facade, moments of dry humor when observing Helena's more creative interpretations of history. Flashes of insight when discussing literature during their increasingly frequent encounters in the library, the raw vulnerability he had displayed at Catherine's tomb. These glimpses suggested depths that contradicted his reputation as a man whose heart had died with his wife. The heart was very much alive, Grace suspected, merely heavily guarded by a man who had learned that love brought pain. She understood such caution all too well. Her own heart had been damaged by Timothy Blackwell's callous rejection when her family's financial circumstances deteriorated. His swift transfer of affections to the wealthy Miss Harrington had taught Grace valuable lessons about the intersection of love and pragmatism in their society. But unlike York, she had refused to let that disappointment calcify into permanent distrust. Each heart required different healing, and perhaps the Duke's needed longer than most. Sighing, Grace tucked the contract into her pocket and located the Wordsworth volume. Her position at Thornwick was now secure, which meant she could continue her work with Helena. As for her inconvenient feelings toward the Duke, those would need to be carefully contained, for the sake of both her position and her heart. Autumn gave way to winter, transforming Thornwick's grounds into a landscape of crystalline beauty. Snow blanketed the gardens, and frost traced delicate patterns across the windowpanes. Within the manor, subtle changes continued to unfold, as York found himself increasingly drawn into Helena's daily life through Grace's gentle but persistent influence. "Your presence at Helena's music recital would mean a great deal to her," Grace had suggested one afternoon. "She has practiced diligently to master Clementi's sonatina." York had intended to refuse, citing estate business that required his attention. Instead, he found himself seated in the music room at the appointed hour, watching as Helena's fingers moved with careful precision across the pianoforte keys. Her concentration was evident in the slight furrow between her brows, an expression so reminiscent of Catherine that York felt a pang of recognition. When the final notes faded, Helena looked to him with naked hope in her eyes. "That was beautifully played," York said, surprising himself with the warmth in his voice. "Your mother would have been most impressed with your progress." Helena's face illuminated with pleasure. Truly, father. Truly, York rose, awkward in the face of his daughter's delight. Perhaps you might play for me again next week. I should like to hear how your studies progress. I would like that very much, Helena replied, her formal words contrasting with her beaming smile. From the corner of the room, Grace observed their exchange with quiet satisfaction. Her gaze met York's briefly, conveying approval that both gratified and discomforted him. These small interactions accumulated over the weeks, each one wearing away at the barriers York had constructed around his emotions. He found reasons to join Helena for breakfast rather than taking the meal in his study. He began asking about her lessons, genuinely interested in her progress. Most significantly, he initiated conversations about Catherine, sharing memories that allowed Helena to know the mother she had lost. Throughout this gradual thawing, Grace remained a constant presence, encouraging without pushing, suggesting without demanding, creating opportunities for father and daughter to reconnect, while never inserting herself inappropriately into their relationship. Yet paradoxically, as York opened himself to Helena, he became increasingly aware of Grace's effect on his carefully ordered existence. He noticed how lamplight caught the auburn highlights in her hair, how her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, how her voice softened when she spoke to an upset child or anxious servant. These observations troubled him, not merely because they represented a distraction from his responsibilities, but because they awakened feelings he had believed permanently dormant. One evening, as snow fell heavily outside, York found himself in the library after dinner. The room had become a shared territory of sorts, a neutral ground where he and Grace might converse about Helena's education without the formality their respective positions otherwise demanded. Tonight, however, Grace was absent, and York found himself missing her presence with an intensity that could no longer be dismissed as mere appreciation for her conversational skills. The door opened, interrupting his thoughts. Grace entered, carrying several books, and startled visibly upon seeing him. "Your Grace, I apologize for the intrusion. I thought you were meeting with your steward this evening." "Our discussion concluded earlier than anticipated," York explained, rising from his chair. "Please don't let me disturb your purpose. I was only returning these volumes Helena has finished." Grace moved to the appropriate shelves, replacing each book in its designated position. York watched her movements, noting the graceful efficiency with which she handled the leather-bound tomes. "You've made remarkable progress with Helena's education," he observed. "My mother commented just yesterday on the improvement in her deportment and conversation." Grace smiled, pleased by the recognition. Lady Helena is eager to learn. She particularly enjoys our history lessons, though I must confess she finds the succession of monarchs less interesting than the scandals associated with their courts. "A preference she likely inherited from her mother," York remarked, his tone softer than usual. "Catherine once declared that history without gossip was merely a tedious list of dead men's names." "A perceptive observation," Grace replied, her eyes meeting his. "The human elements are what make the past relatable after all." Indeed, York found himself moving closer, drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand. "Miss Ashford, Grace, I find myself increasingly grateful for your presence at Thornwick, not merely for Helena's benefit, but for the perspective you have brought to us all." Grace's expression registered surprise at his use of her given name, followed by a hint of color in her cheeks. "I'm honored by your assessment, Your Grace." "York," he corrected impulsively. "When we are speaking privately, I should prefer you use my name rather than my title." The request crossed a boundary both recognized as significant. Grace hesitated, clearly weighing the implications. "I'm not certain that would be appropriate," she finally responded, her voice careful. "Perhaps not," York acknowledged. "Yet formality seems increasingly artificial between us, given the nature of our conversations." "Our conversations concern Lady Helena," Grace reminded him gently. "Initially, yes, but they have evolved, have they not? We have discussed literature, philosophy, education, subjects far beyond Helena's curriculum." Grace couldn't deny this truth. Their exchanges had indeed expanded, sometimes continuing long after Helena had been discussed. "Nevertheless, Your Grace," You see, York interrupted, a hint of frustration coloring his voice. The title serves as a barrier, a reminder of positions and propriety that constrains genuine communication. Perhaps such constraints serve a necessary purpose, Grace suggested quietly. York studied her face, reading the conflict there, a mirror to his own uncertainty. You fear greater familiarity might lead to complications. Wouldn't it? Her direct question hung between them, demanding equal honesty. Before York could respond, the library door opened, revealing Stevens with a letter on a silver tray. Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but an express has arrived from London. The messenger indicated it required immediate attention. The moment shattered, York stepped back, resuming his ducal bearing as though the previous conversation had never occurred. Thank you, Stevens. Miss Ashford was just leaving. Grace recognized the dismissal and curtsied formally. Good night, Your Grace. Alone with the letter, York broke the seal, grateful for the distraction from thoughts he was not yet prepared to confront. The contents, however, only compounded his disquiet. His London solicitor reported rumours of financial instability surrounding Lord Ashford's recent investments, the same Lord Ashford who, if York recalled correctly, was Grace's brother. The implications were troubling. If Grace's family faced financial difficulties, her position at Thornwick might represent more than a respectable occupation. It might be essential to their survival. This knowledge cast their interaction in a different light, introducing questions about her motives for seeking employment in his household. York dismissed the cynical thought almost immediately. Grace's genuine concern for Helena was beyond question, as was her integrity in all their dealings. Yet the information created a new complication. If he allowed their relationship to develop beyond employer and governess, would she welcome his interest out of genuine feeling or practical necessity? The question was precisely the sort that had led him to retreat from society after Catherine's death. The Duke's wealth and title made it impossible to distinguish genuine affection from calculated interest, an uncertainty that poisoned even the most promising connections. York returned the letter to its envelope, his earlier warmth cooling into familiar reserve. Grace Ashford had indeed begun to awaken feelings he had thought forever buried, but tonight's revelation served as a timely reminder of why he had chosen emotional isolation in the first place. Better to maintain appropriate distance than risk the pain of discovering that what appeared to be genuine connection was merely another exercise in social advancement. Grace knew something had changed the moment she entered the breakfast room the following morning. York sat at the head of the table, his attention fixed on the newspaper before him, his demeanor noticeably cooler than it had been in recent weeks. "Good morning, Your Grace," she greeted, taking her usual seat to Helena's right. "Miss Ashford," he acknowledged without looking up, the formal address confirming her suspicion that their conversation in the library had somehow altered their fragile rapport. Helena glanced between them, sensitive to the subtle shift. "Father, may I show Miss Ashford the ice formations on the lake this morning? They've created the most extraordinary patterns." "If Miss Ashford believes it fits within your educational schedule," York replied, his tone neutral. "Nature study is certainly educational," Grace affirmed, smiling at Helena while puzzling over the Duke's renewed distance. For the remainder of breakfast, York remained politely detached, directing his limited conversation toward Helena alone. When he excused himself to attend to estate matters, Grace felt equal measures of relief and disappointment at his departure. "Is father angry?" Helena asked once they were alone. "I don't believe so," Grace assured her, though uncertainty colored her voice. "Adults sometimes have concerns that affect their manner without relating to those around them." Helena appeared unconvinced, but accepted the explanation. Their morning proceeded with the planned lessons, culminating in a brief expedition to observe the frozen lake. The winter landscape's stark beauty provided a welcome distraction from Grace's troubled thoughts. It was late afternoon when Stevens delivered a letter addressed to Grace, the first correspondence she had received since arriving at Thornwick. She recognized Edward's handwriting immediately and broke the seal with growing apprehension, for her brother rarely wrote without purpose. The contents confirmed her worst fears. Edward's investments had collapsed entirely, leaving him not merely without expected profits, but deeply in debt to several creditors. Their modest family home would have to be sold, and even then, significant obligations would remain. "I hesitate to burden you further," Edward wrote, "but I must ask if you might apply to the Duke for an advance on your salary. Even a modest sum would help secure temporary lodgings, while I attempt to salvage what remains of our prospects." Grace folded the letter with trembling hands. Her own position was secure, but her brother's situation was dire. The request for an advance was reasonable given the circumstances, yet approaching the Duke with such a petition felt daunting, particularly given his recent withdrawal. That evening, she requested a private audience, which York granted with apparent reluctance. She found him in his study, seated behind the massive desk that served as both functional workspace and symbolic barrier. "Miss Ashford," he acknowledged, gesturing to the chair opposite, "how may I assist you?" Grace gathered her courage. "Your Grace, I find myself in the uncomfortable position of needing to request a favor. My brother has written with news of unexpected financial difficulties, and I was hoping it might be possible to receive an advance on a portion of my salary." York's expression remained impassive, though something flickered briefly in his eyes. "I see these difficulties. They are severe, I gather." "Unfortunately, yes. Several investments have failed simultaneously, leaving my brother with significant debts." "Investment failures are rarely simultaneous unless the investor has concentrated his capital unwisely," York observed, his tone oddly detached. "Your brother appears to have exercised poor judgment." The assessment, while accurate, strung with its coldness. "Edward has made mistakes," Grace acknowledged, "but he acted with good intentions, hoping to secure our family's future." "Good intentions provide cold comfort to creditors," York replied. "However, your request is reasonable given your service to this household. Stevens will arrange the advance tomorrow." "Thank you, Your Grace." Grace rose, recognizing the dismissal implicit in his manner, yet hesitated before turning to leave. "May I ask if I have given some offense? Your demeanor toward me has altered noticeably since yesterday evening." York looked momentarily startled by her directness before his expression settled back into careful neutrality. "Not at all. I have merely been reminded of certain realities regarding our respective positions that I had perhaps allowed to become blurred in recent weeks." "Realities," Grace repeated, a creeping understanding dawning. "You learned of my family's financial troubles before I came to you, didn't you?" The slight tightening of York's jaw confirmed her suspicion. "And this knowledge has led you to question my motives in our interactions," she continued, indignation rising. "You believe I have encouraged a familiar relationship to secure financial advantage." "I made no such accusation," York responded stiffly. "You didn't need to." "It's evident in your sudden formality, your retreat behind title and position." Grace felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. "I have never sought anything from you beyond proper respect for my work with Lady Helena." "Your work with Helena remains beyond reproach," York stated carefully. "But my character is now suspect," Grace finished for him. "Because my family faces hardship, you assume calculation where there was only genuine." She stopped herself, unwilling to name the feelings that had been developing. "Genuine respect," she amended. York rose, his height imposing even across the expanse of the desk. "Miss Ashford, you misinterpret my caution. I simply recognize that circumstances often influence behavior in ways individuals themselves may not fully acknowledge." "What a convenient philosophy," Grace replied, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "It allows you to dismiss any genuine connection as potentially motivated by advantage-seeking. A perfect justification for maintaining emotional isolation." The words struck with precision, causing York to stiffen visibly. "You presume too much regarding my motivations, Miss Ashford." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but I am not the only one making presumptions, Your Grace." With that, Grace curtsied formally and left the study, maintaining her composure until she reached the privacy of her chambers. There, she finally allowed the tears to fall, not merely for the insult to her integrity, but for the painful recognition that York's renewed distance stemmed from deep-rooted distrust she might never be able to overcome. The atmosphere at Thornwick grew increasingly strained as January yielded to February. York and Grace maintained scrupulously polite interactions in Helena's presence, but their former warmth had vanished, replaced by careful formality that confused and distressed the child. "Why won't Father join us for our reading afternoons anymore?" Helena asked one day as they worked on her French pronunciation. He used to enjoy the stories. Grace hesitated, unwilling to burden Helena with adult complications. "Your father has many responsibilities that demand his attention, especially during these winter months when estate matters require careful management." The explanation sounded hollow even to her own ears, but Helena nodded with the resignation of a child accustomed to adult evasions. "Will he at least attend the Valentine's Day celebration at church? Mrs. Tibbs says all the local families will be there." Grace had forgotten about the parish event, a modest gathering to celebrate St. Valentine's feast day, combining religious observance with community socializing. "I'm sure he'll consider it if you express your wish for his company," she suggested, though privately doubting York would willingly participate in such a public occasion. To her surprise, when Helena made the request at dinner that evening, York agreed without hesitation. "If it's important to you, I shall certainly attend," he told his daughter, carefully avoiding Grace's startled gaze. The Duke of Ravenscroft's presence at the parish celebration caused considerable excitement among the local gentry, who had grown accustomed to his absence from community events. York endured the attention with rigid courtesy, positioning himself near the church entrance where he could acknowledge arrivals without encouraging extended conversation. Grace observed him from across the decorated parish hall, noting the tension evident in his posture despite his outward composure. Helena had been quickly swept into a group of children playing a Valentine's game involving paper hearts and riddles, leaving York isolated amid the gathering. The vicar's wife approached Grace, following her line of sight. "His Grace does us great honor by attending, though he seems rather uncomfortable with the festivities." "The Duke prefers more sedate environments," Grace replied diplomatically. "So we've all observed these many years," the older woman agreed, "which makes his presence today all the more remarkable. One wonders what, or perhaps who, might have influenced such a change." The knowing look accompanying this observation made Grace acutely aware of the speculation her position at Thornwick had likely generated among the local community. Before she could formulate a response that would discourage such conjecture, a commotion near the entrance captured everyone's attention. Lord and Lady Whitmore had arrived, accompanied by a striking woman whose elaborate gown and confident bearing immediately identified her as a visitor from London society. The newcomer's gaze fixed on York with unmistakable recognition, and she moved directly toward him, hand extended. "Duke, what an unexpected pleasure to find you mingling with your tenantry. Lady Whitmore assured me you never attended such gatherings, but I insisted we must at least make an appearance before continuing to their estate." York took the offered hand with visible reluctance. "Lady Harrington, I wasn't aware you were visiting the neighborhood." The name struck Grace like a physical blow. Lady Eliza Harrington, the woman Timothy Blackwell had abandoned Grace to pursue. The coincidence seemed too cruel to be mere chance, particularly when Lady Harrington's assessing gaze swept over Grace with flicker of recognition. "Miss Ashford, isn't it? We met briefly at the Marchioness of Stillwell's musical evening some years ago. How surprising to find you here." "Lady Harrington," Grace acknowledged with a curtsy, painfully aware of York's sudden attention. "Yes, I recall our introduction. Miss Ashford serves as my daughter's governess," York explained, his tone carefully neutral. Lady Harrington's perfectly arched eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed. How fortunate for Lady Helena to have such accomplished guidance. I remember you were quite the accomplished pianist, Miss Ashford, before your family's unfortunate reversal." The deliberate reference to the Ashfords' financial difficulties could not have been more pointed. Grace felt heat rising to her cheeks, but maintained her composure. Music remains an important part of Lady Helena's education. I'm sure His Grace appreciates your many talents, Lady Harrington replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. You must join us, Duke. Lady Whitmore has been most insistent that you dine with us before I return to London. York's expression remained impassive. My schedule is rather full at present, but please convey my regards to Lord Whitmore. The exchange continued with similarly stilted courtesy, but Grace had already withdrawn, making her way to where Helena played with the other children. The encounter with Lady Harrington had shaken her more than she cared to admit, not merely because of the woman's connection to her past disappointment, but because of the obvious implication that York belonged in a social sphere where Grace could only ever be considered a subordinate. When the time came to return to Thornwick, Grace pleaded a headache and rode in the second carriage with Helena's maid, unable to face York's scrutiny after Lady Harrington's revelations. She spent the evening in her room, ostensibly resting, but actually composing a letter to Edward informing him that an advance on her salary would be forthcoming. The following morning, a message arrived requesting her presence in the Duke's study immediately after breakfast. Grace prepared herself for questions about her acquaintance with Lady Harrington, determined to maintain her dignity despite the humiliation of having her personal history exposed. York stood by the window when she entered, his back to the door, hands clasped behind him. "Thank you for coming, Miss Ashford," he said without turning. "I wish to speak with you regarding yesterday's encounter." "I assumed as much, Your Grace," Grace replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Now he did turn, his expression unreadable. Lady Harrington's remarks were deliberately designed to cause discomfort. "I apologize that you were subjected to such tactics in my presence." The apology caught Grace off guard. "Your Grace need not apologize for another's behavior." "Perhaps not, but I regret not intervening more directly." York moved away from the window, reducing the distance between them. "Lady Harrington's interest in me is long-standing and unwelcome. Her comments regarding your circumstances were calculated to establish a social distinction she believes significant." "The distinction exists regardless of her emphasis," Grace pointed out quietly. "As you yourself recently reminded me." York winced slightly at the reference to their previous confrontation. "Yes, I did, and in doing so, I behaved no better than Lady Harrington, using your circumstances to create distance when in truth—" He hesitated, seemingly struggling with his next words. "When in truth, I was protecting myself rather than responding to any actual impropriety on your part." The admission hung in the air between them, its implications too significant to be immediately addressed. Grace found herself unable to maintain her defensive posture in the face of such unexpected honesty. "Your caution was not entirely unreasonable," she acknowledged. "My family situation does place me in a position where financial security is of greater consequence than it might otherwise be." "Yet you've never once leveraged your influence with Helena to secure advantage," York observed. "Even your request for an advance was made with evident reluctance and only after receiving your brother's letter." Grace looked up, startled. "How did you know the timing of Edward's letter?" A hint of discomfort crossed York's features. "Stevens mentioned delivering correspondence to you that afternoon. I drew the logical conclusion." The explanation made sense, yet Grace sensed something left unsaid. Before she could pursue the matter, York continued. "I have been unfair in my assessment of your character, Miss Ashford. The truth is, your presence at Thornwick has brought about changes I find simultaneously welcome and disquieting. My response to this discomfort was to retreat behind the very barriers you have helped Helena begin to dismantle." The vulnerability in this confession touched Grace deeply. Change is often uncomfortable, particularly when it challenges long-held beliefs about ourselves and others. "Indeed." York moved closer still, close enough that Grace could detect the faint scent of sandalwood that seemed to accompany him. "You once accused me of maintaining emotional isolation as a means of self-protection. You were correct. After Catherine's death, I discovered that grief could be managed through careful containment, by limiting connections that might lead to further pain." "And now," Grace asked softly, "now I find that containment increasingly difficult to maintain." His grey eyes held hers with an intensity that sent a tremor through her, particularly in your presence. Grace's heart quickened at the implication, even as caution urged restraint. Your Grace, York, we occupy positions that make any personal connection beyond friendship problematic. I am acutely aware of the constraints, he agreed. Yet I find myself increasingly unwilling to allow societal expectations to dictate the boundaries of my private relationships. Society's expectations exist for reasons beyond mere convention, Grace reminded him gently. They protect individuals from imprudent attachments and painful inequalities. York's expression hardened slightly. They also preserve artificial distinctions that value birth and fortune above character and compatibility. Perhaps, Grace conceded. But those distinctions remain powerful forces in the world we inhabit, regardless of our personal philosophies. This reality hung between them, acknowledged but unresolved. Finally, York stepped back, restoring a more appropriate distance. I have kept you from your duties long enough, he said, his tone warming slightly. I merely wish to apologize for my behavior and assure you that Lady Harrington's implications regarding your position here hold no weight with me. Thank you, Your Grace. Grace curtsied, recognizing that they had reached the limits of what could be safely expressed. Helena awaits her history lesson, so I should take my leave. As she turned to go, York spoke once more. Miss Ashford, Grace, regardless of what constraints we must observe, please know that your presence at Thornwick has been transformative, for Helena certainly, but for me as well. The simple acknowledgement carried more meaning than 1,000 flowery declarations might have. Grace smiled, allowing herself one moment of unguarded emotion before departing. Transformation works in unexpected ways, Your Grace. Sometimes it is the teacher who learns the most valuable lessons. March arrived with softening winds and the first tentative signs of spring. Snowdrops pushed through the melting frost, and birdsong returned to Thornwick's gardens. With the improving weather came a gradual easing of the tension between York and Grace. Their interactions remained proper, but had regained much of the warmth that had characterized their relationship before the misunderstanding. York found himself seeking Grace's company with increasing frequency, often under the pretext of discussing Helena's education, but continuing the conversations well beyond that topic. Their exchanges in the library became a cherished ritual, marked by intellectual stimulation and a growing mutual understanding that transcended their respective positions. You disagree with Wordsworth's notion that nature itself contains moral instruction? Grace asked one evening, her eyes bright with interest as they discussed literature near the fireplace. Not entirely, York replied, enjoying her animated expression. I simply question whether the poet attributes to nature virtues that exist primarily in his own perspective rather than in the landscape itself. A fair point, Grace acknowledged. Though couldn't the same be said of all human experiences? We interpret according to our existing framework of understanding. Indeed, which is why I find your interpretations so intriguing. They often diverge significantly from my own, offering perspectives I might otherwise miss entirely. Grace smiled, accepting the compliment with characteristic grace. Diversity of thought enriches understanding. It's why I encourage Helena to question rather than merely accept established views. A progressive approach to education, York observed. My own tutors would have been scandalized by such encouragement of independent thinking. And yet you developed it nonetheless, Grace noted. Your arguments on the Corn Law reforms demonstrate considerable independent thought, if your comments at dinner with the vicar were any indication. York raised an eyebrow, surprised by her knowledge of his political positions. You follow parliamentary debates, Miss Ashford. When possible, she admitted. My father believed women should understand the political forces shaping their world, even if they cannot directly participate in governance. An enlightened view, and one I increasingly share. York leaned forward slightly. Helena will benefit from such an approach. Catherine would have approved wholeheartedly. The mention of his late wife came naturally now, without the pain that had previously accompanied it. York realized with mild surprise that he had begun to speak of Catherine with fond remembrance rather than raw grief, a change he attributed largely to Grace's influence. Their conversation continued until the mantel clock chimed 11, startling them both with the lateness of the hour. "I should retire," Grace said, rising from her chair. "Helena and I plan an excursion to document the spring flowers tomorrow." "Of course." York stood as well, but instead of the formal good night she expected, he asked, "Would you permit me to accompany you? The eastern meadows have particularly fine wildflowers at this season." Grace appeared momentarily taken aback by the request. "Helena would be delighted by your company." "And you," York pressed gently, no longer willing to hide behind references to his daughter. Color rose in Grace's cheeks. "I would find your company equally pleasant, Your Grace." "York," he corrected softly, "when we are speaking privately, remember." "York," she repeated, the name falling naturally from her lips despite her earlier reservations. "Good night." "Good night, Grace." As she departed, York remained by the fireplace, contemplating the subtle but significant shift in their relationship. The careful distance he had maintained for so many years was steadily dissolving, replaced by a connection he found increasingly difficult to define in conventional terms. Grace was still his daughter's governess, a woman employed in his household and dependent on his goodwill for her livelihood. Yet she was also becoming something more, a confidant whose insight he valued, a companion whose presence he sought, a woman whose smile could lighten his mood even on the darkest days. The complexity of their situation concerned him, particularly given the scandal any acknowledged attachment might generate. Grace's reputation could suffer irreparable damage if their relationship were perceived as improper, while his position would remain relatively unaffected by gossip. The inequality troubled him deeply. Yet despite these concerns, York found himself increasingly unwilling to deny the growing feelings between them. Catherine would have called him a coward for hiding behind societal expectations, particularly when those expectations conflicted with genuine emotion. His late wife had never been one to bow to convention when it contradicted her sense of what was right. With this thought came a realization that had been slowly forming for weeks. Loving Grace would not diminish or betray what he had shared with Catherine. The heart was capable of expanding rather than merely replacing one attachment with another, a truth Grace herself had helped him recognize through her patience with Helena. The question remained, however, of how to proceed without compromising Grace's position or subjecting her to malicious speculation. York had no ready answer, but as he retired to his chambers, he felt a lightness that had been absent for years, the tentative hope that his heart, long believed dead, had merely been dormant, awaiting the right touch to awaken it once more. The excursion to document spring wildflowers became one of many shared activities as March progressed into April. York joined Grace and Helena with increasing frequency, participating in nature studies, history discussions, and even the occasional painting lesson, though his artistic talents proved decidedly limited. "Father, you've made the church tower lean more than the one in Pisa," Helena giggled, comparing their respective watercolors of the village landscape. "Architecture was never my strength," York admitted with good humor. "Perhaps I should confine my efforts to legal documents rather than artistic endeavors." Grace observed their easy interaction with quiet satisfaction. The formal, distant father had been replaced by a man who listened attentively to his daughter's observations and responded with genuine interest. Helena flourished under this attention, growing more confident in expressing her thoughts and less anxious about meeting impossible standards of perfection. The transformation extended beyond father and daughter. Servants noted the Duke's improved temperament, commenting discreetly on his more approachable manner and occasional smiles. The Dowager Duchess remarked that Thornwick itself seemed lighter somehow, as though the manor had shed years of accumulated gloom along with its master. Only Stevens maintained a carefully neutral assessment of the changes, though Grace occasionally caught the butler watching her interactions with York with an expression that suggested both approval and concern. His loyalty to the Duke extended to protecting him from potential complications, a category in which Grace increasingly feared she might be included. These concerns crystallized one afternoon when an unexpected visitor arrived at Thornwick. Grace was conducting Helena's French lesson in the morning room when Stevens appeared at the door. "Miss Ashford, a gentleman has called asking specifically to speak with you, a Mr. Edward Ashford." Grace rose in surprise. "My brother is here." "Did he say why?" "Only that the matter is of some urgency," Stevens replied. "I have shown him to the blue drawing room." "Please excuse me, Helena. Continue practicing this passage until I return," Grace instructed, following Stevens with growing apprehension. Edward stood by the window when she entered, his appearance causing Grace a momentary shock. Her brother had always been fastidious about his appearance, but now his clothes showed signs of wear, and his face appeared haggard with worry. "Edward, why didn't you write that you were coming?" She embraced him briefly. "There wasn't time," he replied, his voice tight. "Grace, I've come with distressing news. Lord Harrington has purchased several of my outstanding debts and is threatening immediate collection." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "Lord Harrington? But why would he take interest in your affairs?" "I believe his wife suggested it," Edward explained grimly. "Apparently, Lady Harrington holds some grievance against you, something regarding a Mr. Blackwell from years ago." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Lady Harrington had recognized Grace at the Valentine's Day celebration and observed her interaction with York. Whether from lingering spite over Timothy's prior interest in Grace or concern about the Duke's apparent regard for his daughter's governess, she had chosen to strike at Grace through her brother's vulnerability. "This is my fault," Grace whispered. "She's using you to punish me for perceived offenses." "What offenses could you possibly have committed against one of the most fashionable women in London?" Edward asked, bewildered. Before Grace could attempt an explanation, the door opened to reveal York, his expression shifting from surprise to controlled courtesy at the sight of the visitor. "Forgive the interruption. Stevens mentioned that your brother had arrived, Miss Ashford. I wish to ensure you had appropriate privacy for your reunion." "Your Grace," Edward bowed deeply. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. I would not have intruded without pressing cause." York's gaze moved between the siblings, noting their similar features and equally troubled expressions. "No apology necessary, Mr. Ashford. Family matters often require immediate attention." An uncomfortable silence fell as York clearly debated whether to withdraw or inquire further. Grace made the decision for him. "My brother brings concerning news, Your Grace. It appears Lord Harrington has purchased several of Edward's debts and is demanding immediate payment." York's expression darkened. "Harrington? That seems an unusual business decision for a man known primarily for his hunting prowess rather than financial acumen." "The suggestion apparently came from Lady Harrington," Grace added quietly. Understanding dawned in York's eyes, a flash of anger quickly controlled. "I see, and the sum in question?" Edward hesitated before answering. £800, Your Grace. An amount I cannot possibly raise in the time allowed." "Which is?" 3 days, Edward replied miserably, "after which legal proceedings will commence." York's jaw tightened. "Mr. Ashford, would you excuse your sister and me for a few moments? There is a matter we must discuss privately before addressing your situation." Edward looked to Grace, who nodded reassuringly. Once he had left the room, York turned to her, his expression grave. "This is Lady Harrington's response to what she observed between us at the parish celebration," he stated flatly. "It would appear so," Grace agreed, mortification coloring her voice. "I never imagined she would resort to such tactics, nor that her influence with Lord Harrington was sufficient to prompt such action. Eliza Harrington has always been remarkably resourceful in pursuing her objectives," York remarked with evident distaste. "In this case, her objective is clearly to remove you from Thornwick by forcing your brother into bankruptcy." Grace felt despair washing over her. "She will succeed. Edward has no means of raising such a sum, and my savings from my position here, while generous, amount to barely £100. "I could provide the funds," York said quietly. Grace looked up sharply. "I couldn't possibly accept." You could, he interrupted, but I understand why you might refuse. Such assistance would create precisely the relationship Lady Harrington wishes to insinuate exists between us. Even if that weren't a concern, Grace argued, accepting such a substantial gift would place me under an obligation I could never hope to repay. York moved closer, his voice dropping. There are matters more important than financial obligations, Grace. Lady Harrington's malicious intervention stems from what she perceived between us, a connection she recognized as threatening to her own ambitions. Her perception doesn't justify. Her perception was accurate, York stated firmly. There is a connection between us, one I have been increasingly unwilling to deny or disguise. The question is whether you acknowledge it as well. Grace felt her heart racing at his directness. I do, she admitted softly. But acknowledging a connection doesn't resolve the practical realities of our different positions. Perhaps not, York agreed, but it provides context for the decision before us. If I assist your brother financially, society will indeed draw certain conclusions. Some of those conclusions may approach the truth that I care for you beyond what might be considered appropriate for an employer toward his daughter's governess. The open admission hung between them, too significant to be casually addressed. Grace struggled to maintain clarity of thought despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. If you help Edward, my position here would become untenable, she finally said. Regardless of the truth between us, appearances would compromise my effectiveness as Helena's governess. Then perhaps it is time to consider whether that role remains the most appropriate one for you at Thornwick, York suggested, his gaze intensely focused on her face. Grace stared at him, scarcely daring to interpret his meaning. What alternative do you propose? Before York could respond, a knock at the door announced Edward's return. The moment for clarity passed as practical matters reasserted their urgency. Mr. Ashford, York addressed him formally. I shall arrange payment of your debts to Lord Harrington through my solicitor. The matter will be resolved within 24 hours. Edward appeared stunned by this declaration. Your Grace, while I'm overwhelmed by your generosity, I cannot accept such charity. It is not charity, York corrected. It is an investment. You will repay the amount as your circumstances allow, with modest interest. My solicitor will draw up appropriate documents. Relief washed over Edward's features, though confusion remained evident in his eyes as he glanced between York and Grace. I don't know how to express my gratitude, Your Grace. There is no need for gratitude when honorable people conduct business in good faith, York replied smoothly. Now, I suggest you remain at Thornwick tonight. Tomorrow we shall discuss a more sustainable resolution to your financial challenges. After Edward had been shown to a guest chamber, York and Grace found themselves alone once more in the drawing room. The unresolved question of their relationship hung heavily between them. This changes everything, Grace said quietly. Perhaps it simply accelerates what was already changing, York countered. Lady Harrington's interference has forced us to confront matters we might otherwise have continued to navigate gradually. And how do you propose we proceed? Grace asked, vulnerability evident in her voice. York's expression softened, not hastily, despite the pressure of circumstances. What exists between us deserves careful consideration rather than reactions born of external threats. The measured response both relieved and disappointed Grace. Part of her had hoped for grand declarations, while another recognized the wisdom of his restraint. For now, we should present a united but appropriate front regarding your brother's situation, York continued. Beyond that, he hesitated, then reached for her hand, the touch sending warmth through her despite its propriety. Beyond that, I ask only that you remain open to possibilities neither of us might have anticipated when you first arrived at Thornwick. Grace curled her fingers around his briefly before withdrawing. I believe I can promise that much, at least. As she left to check on Helena, Grace felt herself balanced precariously between worlds. The familiar one, where she served as governess, and the undefined territory York's words had opened before her. Lady Harrington's scheme had intended to separate them, yet it had instead precipitated a confrontation with feelings too significant to be easily dismissed. Whatever came next would undoubtedly alter the course of her life. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. York stood at his study window, watching as Grace and Helena strolled through the gardens below. Their heads were bent together in conversation, Grace's hand occasionally gesturing to emphasize a point, while Helena nodded attentively. The scene embodied everything that had changed at Thornwick over the past months: the warmth, the communication, the genuine connection that had been missing for so long. The door opened behind him, admitting Stevens with the afternoon post on a silver tray. "The documents from your solicitor have arrived, Your Grace," the butler announced, "and Lady Harrington has sent a note requesting an audience at your earliest convenience." York turned from the window, his expression hardening at the mention of Lady Harrington. "Place the legal papers on my desk. As for Lady Harrington, please inform her that I am fully engaged with family matters and cannot receive visitors at present." "Very good, Your Grace." Stevens hesitated before adding, "Lord Whitmore's carriage was observed delivering her ladyship to the village this morning. It seems likely she may call regardless of your response." "Then she will find herself unwelcome," York replied firmly. "Thornwick's hospitality does not extend to those who attempt to manipulate my household through underhanded financial maneuvers." Stevens bowed, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts on this uncharacteristically direct statement. "Will Mr. Ashford be joining you for dinner this evening?" "Yes, and Stevens," York paused, considering his next words carefully. "You have served this family with exemplary discretion for many years. I value your judgment and your loyalty above all other qualities." "Thank you, Your Grace. In light of that loyalty, I feel I should inform you that certain changes may be forthcoming at Thornwick, changes that might initially appear unconventional." Stevens' eyebrows rose slightly, though his voice remained neutral. "One adapts to change more readily when it brings improvement, Your Grace. Recent months have seen considerable improvement in the general atmosphere of Thornwick." The subtle endorsement did not go unnoticed. York nodded, acknowledging the butler's perceptiveness. "Indeed, please ensure that Lady Helena's riding lesson is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. I intend to accompany her and Miss Ashford to survey the north pastures." "I shall make the arrangements," Stevens replied, withdrawing with his customary efficiency. Alone again, York turned his attention to the legal documents his solicitor had prepared. The terms for Edward Ashford's debt repayment were generous, but not excessively so, a structure that would preserve the young man's dignity while ensuring he developed greater financial responsibility. York had also included provisions for Edward to serve as local agent for certain of York's more distant properties, providing both employment and experience in estate management. The arrangement would resolve the immediate crisis while offering Edward a path toward financial recovery. More significantly, it would remove any suggestion that York's assistance represented charity toward Grace's family rather than a legitimate business transaction. As for Lady Harrington's attempted interference, York intended to address it directly rather than allowing her to control the narrative. By purchasing Edward's debts with such obvious malice, she had demonstrated precisely the kind of calculated cruelty that had driven York from society after Catherine's death. The difference now was that he no longer felt compelled to retreat from such machinations, not when doing so would mean abandoning Grace to the consequences of Eliza Harrington's spite. The real question remaining was how to proceed with Grace herself. Their relationship had evolved far beyond employer and employee, yet the constraints of their respective positions remained. Any acknowledged attachment between them would generate scandal, particularly given Grace's role in his household. Helena's education and well-being had to be considered, as did Grace's reputation and future security. York was still contemplating these complexities when Stevens returned, his usually impassive features showing distinct signs of agitation. "Your Grace, despite my clear communication of your unavailability, Lady Harrington has arrived at the main entrance and is insisting upon seeing you immediately. She claims the matter concerns Miss Ashford and cannot be delayed." York's jaw tightened. Show her to the blue drawing room, Stevens. I shall join her shortly. When York entered the drawing room 10 minutes later, a deliberate delay to establish control of the interaction, he found Eliza Harrington examining a porcelain figurine with an air of critical assessment. "Lady Harrington," he acknowledged coolly, "I understand you disregarded my express wishes regarding visitors today." Eliza set down the figurine and turned to face him, her fashionable green visiting dress emphasizing her statuesque figure. "Some matters cannot wait upon convenience, Duke, particularly when they concern the welfare of your household." "How considerate of you to concern yourself with my household's welfare," York replied, making no effort to disguise his sarcasm. "Especially after attempting to force the brother of my daughter's governess into bankruptcy through the purchase of his debts." Eliza's carefully composed expression faltered momentarily. "You're remarkably well informed about Mr. Ashford's financial affairs." "Just as you were remarkably well informed about their existence," York countered. "A coincidence, I'm sure, given your husband's usual disinterest in minor financial investments." "Perhaps Lord Harrington has developed new interests," Eliza suggested, recovering her poise. "But we digress from the purpose of my visit, which concerns Miss Ashford directly." York remained standing, pointedly not inviting her to sit. "I can conceive of no legitimate reason for you to involve yourself with any member of my staff." "Can you not?" Eliza's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "Then allow me to enlighten you. Miss Ashford is not merely your daughter's governess. She is a woman with a history that may be relevant to her position in your household." "All of us have histories, Lady Harrington. Yours, for instance, includes marrying Lord Harrington with remarkable haste after pursuing a brief attachment to the same gentleman who once courted Miss Ashford." The direct reference to Timothy Blackwell clearly startled Eliza, who had not expected York to be so well informed about past connections. "Ancient history," she dismissed with a wave of her gloved hand. "My concern is more immediate. Are you aware that Miss Ashford has been corresponding regularly with her brother throughout her employment here? Letters that may well have contained information about your household and personal affairs." "I am not in the habit of monitoring my staff's private correspondence," York replied coldly, "nor do I consider family communication evidence of impropriety." "Perhaps not," Eliza conceded. "But the sudden transfer of substantial funds from your accounts to resolve Mr. Ashford's debts might raise questions about the nature of Miss Ashford's influence over you." York stepped closer, his height allowing him to look down at Eliza with undisguised contempt. "Let me be perfectly clear, Lady Harrington. My financial dealings with Mr. Ashford represent a business arrangement documented by my solicitor. Your attempt to leverage those transactions into gossip reflects poorly on your character rather than Miss Ashford's." "You defend her with remarkable vigor," Eliza observed, her tone insinuating. "One might almost suspect a personal attachment beyond employer and employee." "One might suspect many things, Lady Harrington, particularly with a mind inclined toward malicious speculation. What remains factual is that you have intruded where you are not welcome, attempted financial manipulation of someone connected to my household, and now seek to spread innuendo about a woman whose character is beyond reproach." Eliza's confidence visibly faltered under this direct condemnation. "I merely thought you should be aware." "I am aware," York interrupted firmly, "that your visit today concludes any social connection between Thornwick and yourself. Please convey my regards to Lord Harrington, along with my regret that his choice of wife reflects so poorly on his judgment." The dismissal was so direct that even Eliza Harrington could not ignore it. Her face flushed with anger and humiliation as she gathered her belongings. "You may regret this high-handedness, Duke. Society takes note when a man of your standing behaves irrationally in defense of a mere governess." "Society's observations concern me far less than they once did," York replied evenly. "Good day, Lady Harrington. Stevens will show you out." After her departure, York remained in the drawing room, considering the implications of the confrontation. Eliza Harrington would undoubtedly attempt to generate gossip about Grace's position at Thornwick, potentially causing damage to her reputation even if the specific allegations were unfounded. The solution was suddenly, blindingly clear. York had been considering how to navigate the complexities of his feelings for Grace within the existing framework of their relationship. Lady Harrington's interference had demonstrated the futility of such caution. If society would speculate regardless of their actual behavior, perhaps the time for conventional restraint had passed. With this realization came both clarity and resolve. York strode from the drawing room with purpose, instructing Stevens to locate Grace and request her presence in the library immediately. The time had come for decisions that would alter the course of all their lives, decisions too important to be delayed by fears of what others might think or say. Grace entered the library with trepidation, having been informed by Stevens that York wished to see her urgently. She found him standing before the fireplace, his expression suggesting he had reached some significant conclusion during her absence. "You asked to see me, Your Grace?" she inquired, uncertain whether to use his formal title given the butler's presence when delivering the summons. "York," he corrected gently as Stevens closed the door behind her. "And yes, there is a matter of great importance we must discuss." Grace moved further into the room, noting the intensity of his gaze. "Has something happened?" "Is it regarding Edward's situation?" "Your brother's financial matters have been resolved," York assured her. "The legal documents were delivered this afternoon, and Edward has agreed to the terms I proposed, including the position managing the northern properties." Relief washed through Grace. "Thank you. Your generosity will change his circumstances entirely." "It isn't generosity but practical business," York insisted. "Edward has talents that have been misdirected rather than absent. With proper guidance, he may yet become an effective manager." "Nevertheless, I am grateful." Grace hesitated, sensing that Edward's situation wasn't the primary reason for this meeting. "But that isn't why you wish to see me, is it?" "No." York moved away from the fireplace, reducing the distance between them. "Lady Harrington paid an unexpected visit this afternoon." Grace felt her stomach tighten. "I see. What did she want?" "To create precisely the scandal she claimed to be warning against," York replied grimly. "She made insinuations about your correspondence with Edward and suggested that my financial assistance to your brother indicated improper influence on your part." "That's absurd," Grace protested, indignation rising. "I've never—" "I know," York interrupted gently, "and I made my opinion of her allegations abundantly clear. However, her visit forced me to confront certain realities I've been reluctant to acknowledge fully." "What realities?" Grace asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. York's expression softened as he gazed at her. "That I have been attempting to reconcile irreconcilable elements, my feelings for you with the constraints of our current relationship. Lady Harrington's interference has demonstrated that caution and discretion will not prevent speculation or protect your reputation." "So what do you propose?" Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. "Marriage," York stated simply, the word hanging in the air between them with profound significance. Grace stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Marriage." "Yes," York took her hands in his, the touch sending warmth through her despite her shock. "I love you, Grace." "I have struggled against that truth, concerned about the differences in our positions, worried about how society might view such a connection, fearful of opening myself to the vulnerability love demands. But the alternative, continuing to deny these feelings, has become impossible." "York," Grace breathed, overwhelmed by his declaration. "Society would consider such a match inappropriate, a duke marrying his daughter's governess." "Society's opinion matters far less to me than my daughter's happiness and my own," York replied firmly. "Helena adores you already, not merely as her governess, but as the woman who has brought warmth back to Thornwick. As for myself," his grip on her hands tightened slightly, "I believed my heart had died with Catherine, that I was incapable of loving again. You have proven that belief false. You have awakened feelings I thought forever lost." Tears gathered in Grace's eyes, not of sadness but of profound emotion. "I love you too," she admitted softly. "Though I scarce dared acknowledge it even to myself, the difference in our positions seemed too great to overcome." Those differences exist only in artificial constructs of class and wealth, York insisted. In what truly matters, character, intelligence, compassion, we are well matched indeed. Grace searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity in his expression. You truly wish to make me your wife? To face whatever censure might come from such a decision. I do. York released her hands only to cup her face gently between his palms. Life is too precious to sacrifice genuine happiness for the sake of convention. Catherine understood that truth. It was at the core of her being. I dishonor her memory not by loving again, but by refusing to embrace the joy that remains possible in this world. The mention of Catherine touched Grace deeply. She had never felt jealous of York's enduring affection for his first wife, understanding that true love transformed rather than diminished the heart's capacity. If you accept, York continued, we would marry quietly, here at Thornwick rather than in London. Helena would be the only witness we truly need, though I suspect my mother would never forgive us if excluded from the ceremony. A smile broke through Grace's tears at this practical consideration. The Dowager Duchess has been a supporter of mine from the beginning, though I never imagined her encouragement might lead to this outcome. I believe she saw possibilities I was too guarded to recognize, York acknowledged wryly. Mothers often possess uncomfortable insight into their children's hearts. Grace took a deep breath, allowing herself to truly consider his proposal. Marriage to York would transform her life completely, elevating her to a duchess, placing her at the head of one of England's oldest families, subjecting her to scrutiny and potentially criticism from society. Yet it would also unite her permanently with the man she had come to love, allow her to continue nurturing Helena's development, and provide security for her brother as he rebuilt his financial stability. Yes, she said finally, her voice steady despite the magnitude of her decision. I will marry you, York, not for your title or wealth, but for the man you are, the man I have come to know and love during these months at Thornwick. Joy transformed York's features, erasing years of sorrow in an instant. Without hesitation, he drew her into his arms and lowered his lips to hers in their first kiss, a gentle meeting that deepened as Grace responded with equal fervor. When they finally parted, both were breathing unsteadily, their foreheads resting together in a moment of shared intimacy. We should tell Helena, Grace suggested, reluctantly drawing back to more proper distance. This will affect her most directly. York nodded, though he kept hold of her hand, as if unwilling to relinquish physical connection. She will be delighted, I think. She has mentioned more than once how much happier Thornwick seems when you are present. Children often perceive emotional truths adults attempt to disguise, Grace observed with a smile. Helena knew there was something between us long before either of us was prepared to acknowledge it. Then perhaps we should seek her blessing before proceeding further, York suggested, bringing Grace's hand to his lips in a gesture that sent a shiver of pleasure through her. Though I warn you, once obtained, I shall be disinclined to delay making you my duchess. Grace laughed softly at his determined expression. The Duke of Ravenscroft is not accustomed to waiting once his mind is made up, I see. Not when waiting means postponing happiness that has been too long denied, York replied, his tone lightening to match hers. Come, let us find Helena and begin this new chapter properly, as a family united by choice rather than merely circumstance. As they left the library together, Grace felt a profound sense of rightness wash over her. She had come to Thornwick seeking only employment and security, never imagining she would find a home, a family, and a love she had long since stopped believing possible. York had claimed his heart was lost long ago, but Grace knew differently. It had never been lost, merely waiting, like a dormant garden in winter, for the right touch of spring to bring it back to vibrant life. Epilogue. 1 year later. The garden party at Thornwick Manor drew curious glances from London society members who had received the unexpected invitations. Many had accepted out of sheer curiosity, eager to observe firsthand the scandalous marriage that had set tongues wagging throughout the previous season. The Duke of Ravenscroft, long considered permanently removed from the marriage market, had shocked polite society by wedding his daughter's governess, a woman of good family, but modest means, whose brother had reportedly been in financial distress at the time of the engagement. Speculation had run rampant, with theories ranging from romantic to cynical depending on the disposition of the gossiper. What the guests discovered upon arriving at Thornwick, however, defied easy categorization. The manor itself had been transformed from its former austere grandeur to a home of genuine warmth. Flowers filled every available surface, windows stood open to admit summer breezes, and the sound of laughter, particularly children's laughter, echoed through halls once known for their sepulchral silence. At the center of this transformation stood the new Duchess of Ravenscroft, moving among guests with natural grace and quiet confidence. Grace's simple but elegant blue gown complemented her auburn hair, which had been arranged in a style both fashionable and unfussy. Around her throat hung a single strand of pearls, York's wedding gift, selected for their understated beauty rather than ostentatious value. Lady Whitmore observed the Duchess with grudging admiration as she conversed with a group that included several of London's most formidable society matrons. "She manages them remarkably well," she commented to her companion. "One would never guess she spent years as a governess rather than a duchess." Perhaps because being a governess required similar diplomatic skills, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft replied with evident satisfaction. "My son chose his wife with greater wisdom than most men twice his age." Across the garden, York watched Grace with undisguised affection. Helena stood beside him, now 10 years old and blossoming under the combined influence of her father's renewed engagement in her life and Grace's loving guidance. "Father, may I show Cousin Margaret the new foal?" Helena asked, gesturing toward a shy girl hovering near the refreshment table. "Of course, but remember that Margaret may not share your enthusiasm for stable visits," York cautioned with a smile. "Not every young lady enjoys the scent of hay and horses as much as you do." "Grace says people's different preferences make the world interesting," Helena replied confidently. "If Margaret doesn't like the stables, I shall show her my butterfly collection instead." As Helena departed on her diplomatic mission, Edward Ashford approached, his appearance markedly different from the desperate man who had arrived at Thornwick a year earlier. Regular employment managing the Duke's northern properties had restored both his finances and his confidence. "Your Grace," Edward greeted with a bow that balanced respect with the familiarity of their now-established relationship. The improvements to the North Pasture drainage system have been completed ahead of schedule. The tenants are already reporting better conditions for the early hay cutting. "Excellent news," York replied. "Your management of the project has exceeded expectations, Edward. I believe we should discuss expanding your responsibilities to include the western properties as well." Edward's expression brightened at this vote of confidence. "I would welcome the opportunity, Your Grace." As they discussed the details, Grace approached, slipping her arm through York's with the easy intimacy of established marriage. "I see you've abandoned your social duties to discuss business," she teased gently. Lady Harrington has been watching from the terrace with the most fascinating expression of thwarted expectation. York glanced toward the terrace where Eliza Harrington stood with several other guests, her gaze indeed fixed on their small group. "I suspect she anticipated a more dramatic spectacle than a simple garden party hosted by a contented family." "How disappointing for her," Grace replied, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Perhaps we should provide some entertainment by announcing the news." Edward looked between them questioningly, while York's expression softened into a smile of such tenderness that several observing guests found themselves suddenly revising their assumptions about the nature of the match. "Are you certain?" York asked quietly. "We had planned to wait another month." "Helena already knows and can barely contain her excitement," Grace pointed out. "Besides, the Dowager Duchess has been dropping increasingly obvious hints to everyone who will listen." York laughed, the sound carrying across the garden and causing several heads to turn in surprise. The Duke of Ravenscroft, once known for his forbidding demeanor, appeared transformed, relaxed and genuinely happy in a way that contradicted all rumors about his marriage being one of necessity or convenience. "Very well," he agreed, raising his voice to address the assembled guests. Ladies and gentlemen, if I might have your attention for a moment, the Duchess and I have an announcement we would like to share with you all." Conversations ceased as all eyes turned toward them. York drew Grace closer to his side, his pride evident in every line of his body. "We are pleased to inform you that Thornwick will welcome a new addition to our family this winter," he declared, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. "The Duchess and I expect our first child in December." A chorus of congratulations rose from the gathering, genuine in most cases despite the inevitable calculations occurring behind some of the polite smiles. Grace accepted the good wishes with gracious acknowledgement, while York remained protectively at her side, his hand never leaving hers. As the party continued, the Dowager Duchess approached her son and daughter-in-law, satisfaction evident in her shrewd eyes. "Well done, both of you," she said quietly. "Not merely for the coming grandchild, though I am naturally delighted by the prospect, but for what you have accomplished here at Thornwick." York glanced around at the gathering, Helena introducing her shy cousin to another young guest. Edward deep in conversation with a local landowner about agricultural improvements, servants moving efficiently among the visitors with refreshments, the gardens themselves vibrant with summer blooms. "What have we accomplished, Mother?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "You have created a home," the Dowager replied simply. "Not merely a house or an estate, but a true home where love flourishes and healing occurs." "Catherine would be pleased, York, very pleased indeed." The mention of his first wife brought no shadow to York's expression, only thoughtful acknowledgement. "She once told me that love was too precious to be hoarded or limited," he recalled. "At the time, I thought she was speaking of how we should raise Helena. Only later did I understand she was trying to prepare me for a future she suspected she might not share." Grace squeezed his hand gently. "She was wise as well as beautiful then." "Yes," York agreed, his gaze meeting Grace's with undisguised devotion, though not unique in that combination of qualities. Later that evening, after the guests had departed, and Helena had finally been persuaded to retire despite her excitement about the day's events, York and Grace stood together on the terrace, watching as stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Are you happy, Grace?" York asked, his arm around her waist drawing her close against the evening's growing chill. "Truly happy, despite the occasional challenges our unusual match presents." Grace turned within his embrace, reaching up to trace the contours of his face, a face that had become infinitely dear to her over the past year. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she assured him. "The occasional raised eyebrow or whispered comment seems a small price for the joy we've found together." York captured her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "When Catherine died, I believed that part of my life was finished, that love was something I had experienced once and would never know again. I walled myself away, convinced that isolation was preferable to vulnerability." "And now," Grace prompted gently, "now I understand that the heart cannot truly die while life remains," York replied, his voice rich with emotion. "It can be wounded, it can retreat, it can hide behind walls of grief or fear. But given the right care, the right touch, it can heal and grow stronger than before." "Much like Thornwick itself," Grace observed, glancing back at the manor house glowing with warmth and light against the evening sky. "Once somber and closed, now open and welcoming." "Thanks to you," York murmured, lowering his lips to hers in a kiss that conveyed all the love words alone could not express. When they finally parted, Grace rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady heartbeat that had once seemed lost but now pulsed strong and vital beneath her cheek. "Not me alone," she corrected softly. "Every heart awakens in its own time, York. Mine was simply fortunate enough to be present when yours was ready to live again." Above them, stars continued their ancient dance across the heavens, witnesses to the enduring truth that had transformed Thornwick Manor from a house of shadows to a home filled with light. That love, once believed dead, needed only the gentle persistence of a kind soul to rediscover its capacity for life.